Okay, so welcome everybody. Um, we're going to discuss today just yet another portion that relates to Yaakov, Jacob, who represents the constellation, another constellation, the Sphira of Tiferet. And again, when we're discussing those different individuals, we are discussing levels of energy or levels of elevation. And so we're moving from the portion of Vayigash, which is Judah, Yehuda, the brother of Joseph, that is confronting Joseph, Yosef. And so when we're reading the theatrical story, it is a theatrical story, basically. You can make movies out of it, and they have made movies out of it. It's very dramatic, and it's very Hollywood kind of stories. But it's only when you're reading, studying Kabbalah, the Zohar, that you get to realize that it is much more than that. And when we're discussing Yehuda, we were discussing the level of Malchut, the physical reality, and Yosef, Joseph, representing the entrance to the 99%, that is the spiritual realm. And so when Yehuda confronts Joseph, it is the spirit, it is the soul in us that stands up for truth, stands up for what your true calling is, and goes beyond the comfort zone, the mediocrity that we can live in our relationship, business, or life, or health, or whatnot, and confronting the 1% reality. And by doing that, we are elevating our consciousness to what is called Yesod. So although the story, the theater story, is somewhat theatrical and very beautiful, and we can get a lot of lessons out of them, the true meaning is lost in translation. And so that is why we want to study the Zohar, because when we study from the Zohar, then we're getting the true gist of what the story was meant to be told in the first place, and was never really meant to be told as a story, but as codes for people to find the true freedom in their lives. And when we're talking about true freedom, we're not talking about freedom from an individual or a situation or a company. We're talking about a freedom from the desire to receive for the self alone and everything that goes with it. What is it that goes with it? What is it that we want to find freedom from? We want to find freedom from fear, anxiety, and stress, and worry. And this is the true freedom that we are seeking, that at least our soul is looking for. And so as we continue in this portion to discuss Jacob, who is the forefather of all those levels of consciousness when it relates to the tree of life, he is the forefather of the spiritual work because he represents Israel. And Israel, although for the last 70 some years it has been designated as a country, it has been over 3,400 years, 4,000 years ago, that the name was given to begin with. And that name was given to Jacob as he defeated the angel that teased Jacob with all the possible weaknesses that you can imagine. And he overcame all of them. And as a result, he received an uplifting of his consciousness, and that uplifted consciousness is named Israel. And so every time that Jacob is at the best of his game, spiritual game, the Torah refers to him as Jacob. I'm sorry, as Israel. And when he's in distress, the Torah refers to Jacob as Jacob and not anymore Israel. And it's funny because you can see that sometimes the Torah calls him Israel and sometimes the Torah calls him Jacob. It's not a coincidence. It's not that the Torah, it just likes to name people all sorts of names. It is actually coded for a level of consciousness. In the same way, there are different levels of consciousness that we have, and probably to each of our spiritual levels, we should have, a spiritual name. And so maybe when we raise to the level of our Yesod, my name would be A, and then to the level of Netzach, my name would be B or whatnot. And then this is how in the spiritual realms they would refer to as, when they are thinking or speaking about me. And that would be the same for everybody. The same as it was for Jacob, it would be also for me. And so let's connect a bit to what the Zohar has to say on the portion of Vayechi Yaakov. And again, it's interesting because it says Vayechi Yaakov, and again, in this portion, it is also going to be about the death of Jacob. And this is the second time that the Torah does that. Why call the death of a righteous the life of righteous? It says that the way that we die is related to the way that we lived. So if a person lived his entire life or her entire life as a spiritual person, dedicating the existence for service and helping others, it will affect, it will have a positive impact on the way that they're going to depart this world. In a lot of ways, the way that we're departing the world is dealing with how spiritual or how much we were not spiritual in our living. And so this is one take. So the Vayechi Yaakov, it deals with the fact that this man is going to probably die in the most honorable way because of the living of righteousness that he lived his entire life. But also the other take is that the life of an individual truly begins when the person is dead, right? Because when the person is alive, breathing, physically breathing, every given instant we are tasting death because the body consciousness has been imbued by the sin of Adam, and the sin of Adam stems from the connection to death. The whole story about the apple or the tree or whatnot, Adam that did not follow the indications, the directions of the Creator, and as a result, he basically got the fruit of what he planted, which was death. And the death was imbued, was infused in the body consciousness that we are correcting every single day. And so as we're living this tikkun, this correction, this karmic existence, we are tasting death every single minute of the day because the, I would say, ultimate description of what death is desire to receive for the self alone. Because once we are freed from the desire to receive for the self alone, then there is no more reason for the body to die or for the body to even experience decay or, in other words, getting older. And so, again, when we're talking about Vayechi Yaakov, Vayechi Sarah, it is basically in the portion that they died. Like he didn't say Vayechi Sarah in the previous portion when we were talking about her in the one or two portions before that. But we're talking about Vayechi Sarah, Vayechi Yaakov, when they're actually passing. And that is because there is that sense of spiritual freedom, at least for the soul, from the grab of the body consciousness. אמר רבי יוסי, ליבו של יעקב ראה בנבואה ממצרים, שבניו יהיו בכמה גלויות, דהיינו כל הגלויות, שר אתה ועד הקץ וזמן בעת המשיח. And so it says here, and again, this is the type of, I was going to say individual, but it's not really like, like a human being that walks in the street. We're talking here about spiritual giants that in the example of Jacob, it says, and this is the students of Rabbi Shimon that are discussing the level of Jacob, that he saw in prophecy in Egypt, שבניו יהיו בכמה גלויות, that his descendants are going to be in several exiles. When we're talking about exile, we're not talking about the physical exile, although it is accompanied by or illustrated by the physical one. So it's just that the Zohar does not pay so much attention to what happens in the physical when the most important in the seed level is on the spiritual. שבניו יהיו בכמה גלויות, so that his children, and therefore his descendants, יהיו בכמה גלויות, are going to be in several exiles, דהיינו כל הגלויות. In other words, all the possible imaginable exiles, שער אתה ועד הקץ, so until the end of times, וזמן בעת המשיח, until the coming of Messiah. What is the coming of Messiah? Here is another code word. The coming of Messiah is not a prince on a horse or on a donkey or whatever the story is. Be'et HaMashiach, we're talking about the coming of the Mashiach consciousness, where once we all have reached this level of consciousness that we don't need to correct the desire to receive for the self alone, the curtains are removed and truth about the evil inclination is revealed. And therefore it's like you are uncovering all the tricks of a magician. And so you are in like, you're in for a surprise when the magician is surprising you and you don't see the trick. But once you see the trick, you're like, okay, I got you. There is a guy, his name is Julius Dein, D-E-I-N, I think. He's on Instagram and Facebook and whatnot. He's a young kid, not so much young anymore, but he's still young. And he's like a magician, and he's like doing like all these amazing tricks. And obviously, like he has also like he's posting also bloopers. And so the ones that have, like the best views are the ones that he's successful at, but sometimes he's posting also, the ones that he's not successful at, that, that people are uncovering his trick. And when people are uncovering his trick, so he goes into slow motion and, like a sad face and a sad music, because this is exactly what's going to happen when the veils are removed, when the curtains are out, and we are uncovering all the tricks of, the greatest magician, that is the opponent. And once all the tricks are revealed, it is going to be like an instant moment, because we're talking here about the Be'et HaMashiach, that the Messiah is just going to fall on us. It's just like this is why, like the whole story about the matzah, and, it's funny because, as we're approaching Pesach, Passover, the whole baking of the matzah, and, they say that they only had like 18 minutes to bake them, which is not true. They didn't have 18 minutes. Because again, the whole story about the matzah is a whole spiritual take just by itself. But they knew like the night before that in the morning that they're going to leave, etc. But still it is written literally that they did not have time to bake. And so just another example on how we shouldn't take anything that's literal written in the Torah. And so, Vezman Be'et HaMashiach, and so he saw in a prophecy all the exiles of his children and his descendants up to the time of the end of time, because once we're coming to the time of Mashiach and Satan is revealed, then time becomes irrelevant. And time, the way that we experience time, is imbued with malchut, with a desire to receive for the self alone. And so this is why time in our experience, in our human experience, is imbued, is infused with stress and worry and anxiety and resentment. But once we're reaching the end of the physical time as we know it, that's the removal, another aspect, another revelation of the removal of the desire to receive for the self alone, the removal of Satan. And that's what we call Haketz Vizman, so the end of time. Be'et HaMashiach, that where we would find the coming of Messiah. That this is like another thought that comes to me is that, you know, when you have like a aha moment or you have a revelation, like, you know, like in the cartoons, you know, like you have like this light bulb that turns on. So that's basically the Be'et HaMashiach, which is basically like you have a moment of revelation and you're like, oh my gosh, I struggled through this like for 2 months and it was so easy, right? And this moment of revelation, this is like the Be'et HaMashiach. We experience Be'et HaMashiach like hundreds of times every day, every week. But it's in a, I would say like in a minor version, because it is in those small aha moments. ולא הגיע יעקב אל הנבואה של ויחי, אלא במצרים. And it's interesting because he did not reach this prophecy in the portion that is revealed in the portion of Vayechi, אלא במצרים, until he got to Mitzrayim, until he got to Egypt. והיא נבואה חשובה, and this is a very important prophecy. That prophecy reminds me of the prophecy that Aaron had, where his 2 children, Nadav and Avihu, died, and when the news got to him, like the next word after he learned that his children died, it says Vaidom, and he paused. And there is one entity that does that, and it is not the human being, because the human being is always in movement, and it is called the walking, while the angels are called the standing. And so in that moment that he learned of the, can you, like, don't imagine, but it's like the death of his 2 children, and the next action, the next task is Vaidom, and he paused. And he had the vision that his 2 children are going to reincarnate in Pinchas, and Pinchas is going to become Elijah the prophet. So when he saw that from one thing leading to another, death for righteous men do not represent what death represents for us, because we see death as end, as sadness, as separation, as loss. But for righteous men, women, they do not see death as an end. But right away they connected to this power of prophecy that we each possess. If we were to reach that level, to elevate ourselves to that level, we could see at least maybe a glimpse of the cause and effect. And the cause and effect is that in this moment, once he was in Egypt, and Egypt is represented as a narrow consciousness mind. Where do we get that? The word from Mitzrayim, Egypt, starts with Mem Tzadik Resh, which is Metzer, which is narrow. And so when we're talking about Egypt, we're not really talking about, again, another example, we're not talking about a physical country. We're talking about mankind humankind that is walking the face of this earth, and we're not at the best of our game. We are right now in our narrowest mind, and we're connecting to this place that is Mitzrayim, that is narrow-minded. And so it is interesting because it is in that place, physical place, where he needed to reach, where there is basically no light, that he needed to reveal or get the revelation of the end of time, the coming of Messiah. שלא יתבעו כמותה ולא הגיע לשום איש מן בני הנביאים. And so there was no other individual who had such a prophecy comparing to what Jacob just had. אלא לו ולמשה בלבד. Only him and Moses had this type of power of prophecy. במשה כתוב, כי לא יראני האדם וחי, וביעקב כתוב, ויחי יעקב. And so those are the two examples when they prophesied, כי לא יראני האדם וחי, for Moses, וביעקב כתוב, וחי יעקב, ויחי יעקב. So Vayechi Yaakov is actually a moment of prophecy. It's not like the pure translation is and Jacob lived, but it is actually a code for the prophecy that Jacob had. Vayechi Pirusho, and so the definition, interpretation of the word Vayechi, Nevuah, Ayoredet min Marei Meira. And so it is the prophecy that is being downloaded into Jacob, Shehu Tiferet, and Jacob is on that high level that is called Tiferet. פירוש כי הארת החוכמה היא סוד חיים. And so we're going into the depth of this interpretation. It talks about the level of chokhmah, that is the secret of life, that is called chaim. כמו שכתוב, והחוכמה תחיה בעליה. And so it says that chokhmah would live in the upper world, והסוד הנבואה של ויחי, and is the secret of prophecy of Vayechi, which is the name of this portion, that is actually a coded word or a coded name. ויש הפרש גדול בין נבואת יעקב ומשה, and so there is a big difference still between the prophecy of Jacob and the prophecy of Moses, לשאר הנביאים, and the rest of the prophets. כי שאר הנביאים, because the rest of the prophets קיבלו נבואתם מנצח והוד. Because the rest of the righteous, the rest of the prophets received their prophecies from the level of Netzach and Hod, of Zir and Pin. שהוא מדברו ולמטה, so it's a lower stage, ששם בחינת הנוקבה. That is from the aspect of נוקבה, הנקראת אספגלריה שאינה מהירה. And so אספגלריה שאינה מהירה is just another code, ועל כן התבעו במילת כה, שהיא שם הנוקבה. אבל יעקב ומשה קיבלו מתת, but Jacob and Moses received the Tiferet, that is higher than Netzach and Hod. So you have on the tree of life, you have Tiferet, and then you have Netzach and then Hod. And so Moses and Jacob received their prophecy from Tiferet, that is higher, and the rest of the prophets received their power of prophecy from Netzach and Hod. So on the level of Matat, on the level of Tiferet, it is named Aspaglaria de Nahara, שהוא מדבור ולמעלה דזעיר אנפין, אלא מבחינת החורים אשר שם, שעל כן נאמר למשה, וראית את החורם ובני גברנה, וכן לא תוכל לראות פני כי לא יראני האדם בחיים. אבל כשקיבל מבחינת אחרים היו חי, וכן ביעקב לא נאמר, ויחי אלא במצרים שהוא בחינת החורים. Okay. I won't go into those details because it's even hard for me to understand. Here is an interesting aspect, concept from the power of prophecy of Jacob. רצה יעקב, and so Jacob wanted לומר נבואות על הגלויות, and so Jacob wanted to tell the prophecies that he had about the exile, שיקרו לבניו, that would happen to his children, בארץ Canaan, in the land of Canaan, that is today resembling, I would say, partially Israel, ובכל ארץ אשר גרו בה, and in every country that they lived, שהם מארץ מצרים, that is also in the land of Egypt, כלומר שכל הגלויות נכללות בארץ מצרים, that all the exiles are included in the land of Egypt. Again, when we're talking about the land of Egypt, there is the physical aspect, but that's just 1%. There is the 99%, that is the consciousness part. היה ליבו נשבר, שכתוב כי יש שבר במצרים. ועל כן הגיע ויחי יעקב במצרים, ולא היה שמח, כי בארץ יהיה קשרם של העמים, כלומר שכל זוהמת העמים כלולה שם, וגם הספירם של כיסא הכבוד, talks about the different levels of the klipa of Mitzrayim connected to the sin of Adam. That's why I don't want to get into it, because then it's just complicating and making it hard to extract the point of what we want to discuss today. But what is interesting is that he's not exactly telling about the prophecy. And it's interesting because there is another instance where there was an individual who had a prophecy and he didn't tell his son, although he knew about it for 17 years. And that is when Joseph was sold as a slave and his father was to believe that his son died, and his children tricked him and replaced, the blood of an animal, and and brought it to the father, and the father truly believed that he died. And this is the passage in the Torah that the Torah does not refer to Israel as Israel, but goes back to calling him Jacob. But it says that in those 17 years that Jacob was believed to be dead, his father Isaac knew about it and he saw it in a prophecy. So you could ask, so why didn't Isaac speak to his father, to his son Jacob, and tell him, I see that you're sad. Let me comfort you. I had a prophecy and your son is alive. It's interesting, no? And still he kept this prophecy for himself for 17 years. So obviously we're not talking again about regular men walking down the street. We're talking about spiritual giants that found a higher purpose at not revealing a certain secret or prophecy that they were in tune with. And so, and as soon as it was revealed that Joseph was alive, the Torah calls Jacob Israel again. So for 17 years, he was depressed. He was sad that his son, his favorite son, departed this world. Why? Because the Shekhinah, the light force of the Creator, and therefore everything that comes with it, and for a righteous person, for a prophet, we're talking about the power of prophecy that would be gone if there is no happiness. Well, it was gone for 17 years. And his father knew, and he didn't tell him because Jacob needed to go through a process. This is one of the probably harshest lesson. And so therefore, I rarely use this example, but we should use this example for bread of shame. Because Isaac telling Jacob would have been the greatest bread of shame, not just for Jacob, but for all humanity. So we see a person that is struggling and we jump to help. It's a hard one. But is there a reason to begin with why a person is in struggle? When a person struggles once, it's one thing. When a person struggles, you help him, and then he gets into the same kind of trouble. And you help him again because you're a good friend or a good family member, but then the person gets into the same type of trouble. That's basically bread of shame. But this is another category. This is another level entirely, where imagine the grandfather knows about his grandson Joseph that he's alive. Not only that he's alive, but he's going to become the right hand, if not the most powerful person in the world. And he's seen that if he's going to intervene, he's going to interrupt that process. Bless you. So if he's going to intervene and go and tell, oh, Jacob, don't worry, go visit your son. Go help him, he's in prison. Go take advantage. He's been, nominated the governor of the land. The entire process, not just that, but also once there was famine and the brothers confronted last week and the week before, confronted the brother, Joseph. Like there was like a whole back and forth, and Joseph knew them and they didn't know him because they were sure that he died. Like the entire process was correcting on the highest levels. But when we're talking about our forefathers, we're not talking about regular people. They are correcting levels of tikkunim, of corrections for the entire human race. So if they have something that they are holding on to, and it says about Joseph in the previous portion that he lo yachal litapek, he couldn't hold himself, but to tell his brothers, come on, it's me, don't you recognize me? But he did beyond what was humanly possible, and he went through with his plan until Yehuda, Judah, stood up to him to save his brother Benjamin, and this is how he corrected the sin that happened with Joseph, because he is the third. Yehuda is the third brother, and Reuven was the firstborn. And it says about Reuven that he represents people that are mediocre. Mediocre is not like a average, bad, nothing bad about that. It's just that we also experience a similar mediocrity in our life when things are not doing so well, but you know what? It could be worse. And so we go along with it. We numb our senses and we go through the day and go through the week and hoping for better days. This is Reuven. And so Reuven led the way by throwing Joseph into the pit and then selling him as a slave. It was actually Yehuda that inspired the lot of the brothers not to leave him in the pit with the snakes and the scorpions, but actually sell him as a slave. And he had another chance to correct, and he corrected by standing up to his brother and saving his brother Benjamin, which he failed to do with Joseph. So imagine if Jacob knew all that. If Jacob knew that Joseph was alive, the entire process of the correction of Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, we would still be at it. But the righteous, the Kabbalists are saying that in our generation there is one level to correct. This is why it's also the hardest to correct, because it's the level of Malchut. And in the level of Malchut, we have the harshest challenges. Why? Because it comes with the biggest illusion. On the level of Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, those guys have prophecies, spiritual giants. Like they see the future and the present and the past as if it was one. We have, because we are living in Malchut, it is the hardest to correct because it is the biggest illusion. And so this is why it says that when a man or a woman do achieve their spiritual work on the level of Malchut, we are revealing much more light than any righteous that ever lived before. Why? Because our work in this generation, in our era, is so much more difficult than it was 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 years ago, where the consciousness was naturally more elevated. Consciousness naturally more elevated means naturally with less illusion. You didn't need to make a lot of effort to be spiritual, to be connected, to feel connected, to see, hear all sorts of things. It says about the generation of Moses that came after that, by the way, that they all have reached a level of prophecy. After Egypt, they all have reached the level of prophecy. Servants, children, men, women, elderly, everybody reached the level of prophecy. But it was like going to Starbucks. It was natural. For us to get a dream with a significant message, that's already like, wow, I need to call my teacher to get an interpretation about that. But imagine for those guys, it would be like a breathing. And so this is why when we overcome our flaws, our desire to receive for the self alone, we reveal endlessly more light than any of the righteous that we're learning about. And so when we're talking again about Vayechi, and we'll conclude with that, the code word for Vayechi is Biat HaMashiach, which is the end of time, but literally, that there is no more need for time. Time only exists from a merciful perspective, to give mankind an opportunity to correct, to fix what we have done. That's the only reason that time exists. Because we're not tapping into the best aspect of it, time stretches. So this is why when we don't like to be with somebody, time feels like, 5 minutes feels like an hour. But when we love spending time with somebody, 10 hours feels like just like 20 minutes. Time will disappear once we reach the end of time. And that's what we need to meditate. That's what we need to add to our meditations, that we want to get to reach that level of Vayechi, that we don't need anymore this time, that we don't need anymore all the challenges and all the heaviness of the desire to receive for the self alone, and we are already there. God willing. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Yehuda.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, and I'll see you next Monday in 2021.
Yes. Woohoo!
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.